The following story is based on an account from a good friend of mine, Brian, and his father, Joe. It happened back in 2004 when they still lived in Spain. The God of the Mountain. The winding road cut through a mountain in Cáceres like a scar, lit only by the yellowish beam of the old pickup's headlights. Brian gazed out the window, watching the dancing shadows of trees against the night sky. The silence between him and his dad, Joe, was comfortable, broken only by the constant rumble of the engine. It was the early 90s, and these nighttime drives were an unspoken tradition between father and son. Joe was a sturdy man, weathered by time and the roads he traveled. That night they were hauling a load of clothes to relatives in a distant village, something Joe did regularly to help less fortunate family members. Brian cherished these breaks from routine. It was a chance to be close to his dad and hear his stories, even if Joe wasn't much of a talker. As they climbed the mountain, a lone figure appeared on the shoulder. A car was stopped with its hood open, a clear sign of trouble. "That's Tristan," Joe said, recognizing his old friend. Tristan waved a flashlight, relieved to see the pickup approaching. "Man, am I lucky you guys showed up," Tristan said with a tired smile. "The engine overheated and I need a part I can't find around here." Without hesitation, Joe offered help. "We'll take you to get what you need," he said, patting his friend on the shoulder. Brian knew what this meant, a significant delay in their trip. But he didn't complain. He understood how much his dad valued friendships. The next few hours were spent hopping from village to village, searching for the necessary part. Closed workshops, missing mechanics, and a growing sense of urgency. By the time they finally got what they needed, the night had swallowed the last traces of daylight. "Maybe you guys should stay over tonight," Tristan suggested, concerned. "These roads aren't safe at night." But Joe was determined. "We still have time to get there. Besides, I promised to deliver these clothes today." After saying goodbye to Tristan, father and son hit the road again. The road now seemed different, wrapped in dense darkness. Thick vegetation on both sides formed a natural tunnel, and low-lying fog added an air of mystery to the scene. Brian shivered. "Dad, have you heard any stories about this mountain?" he asked, trying to shake off his unease. Joe kept his eyes on the road. "A few. People like to make up legends about places like this." "What kind of legends? Stuff about mountain spirits? Ancient creatures? But they're just stories." Silence settled between them again, but was soon broken when the pickup's engine started to sputter. The temperature gauge shot into the red zone. "Damn it," Joe muttered, pulling over onto the narrow shoulder. "We're out of water for the radiator," Brian noted, worried. Joe sighed. "We'll have to wait for it to cool down a bit before we can move on." Outside, the air was freezing, and there was a feeling like something was watching them. Suddenly, a deep roar echoed through the mountain, so powerful that Brian felt it in his chest. The trees rustled and nocturnal birds scattered into the sky. "What was that?" Brian asked, his eyes wide. Joe tensed up. "Get back in the truck now." They locked themselves inside. Joe slid the door locks down and with trembling hands closed the makeshift curtains he kept to block out light when he needed to sleep in the truck. "Dad, what's going on?" "Stay quiet, son. Don't make a sound." The silence outside was palpable. Brian could hear his own heart pounding. Then heavy footsteps began to echo on the dirt road, slowly approaching. Each step made the ground tremble slightly. A shadow passed in front of the turned-off headlights, blocking the little light the moon provided. Brian peeked through a small gap in the curtain and saw a massive silhouette, impossible to distinguish between human or animal. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something scratched the side of the truck. A metallic sound that made Brian shudder. The creature began circling the vehicle, like a predator sizing up its prey. The air inside the cab felt thin, and the smell of wet earth mixed with something rotten filled their noses. Joe whispered, barely audible, "No matter what happens, don't leave this truck." Before Brian could respond, his dad opened the opposite door and stepped out, closing it softly behind him. Panic set in. "Dad!" He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Through the curtain, he saw Joe take a few steps away and stop. The colossal shadow approached him. The faint light revealed long, muscular legs, claws reflecting the moonlight, and eyes that seemed to glow a yellowish hue. Joe raised his hands, either in surrender or perhaps pleading. He seemed to be murmuring something, but Brian couldn't hear. The creature tilted its head as if observing him with curiosity. Suddenly, a guttural scream tore through the night's silence. Brian couldn't tell if it came from his dad or the creature. The shadow moved quickly, and both disappeared from his view. Despair overwhelmed Brian. Trembling, he decided to do the only thing he could think of: start the truck and get help. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine groaned but didn't start. Come on, he urged, trying again. This time, the engine roared to life. Without thinking, Brian put it in gear and slammed on the gas. The truck lurched forward, but something slammed into the back, almost causing him to lose control. In the rearview mirror, he saw only darkness, but felt that presence closing in. He sped as fast as he could down the narrow curves, his heart pounding wildly. The next few minutes were a blur of trees whipping past and the engine working at its limits. He didn't know if he was being followed or if his dad was still alive. Finally, he spotted the lights of a small village. Relief washed over him so intensely that tears streamed down his face. He stopped in front of a tavern where some men were chatting outside. "Help!" he shouted, jumping out of the truck. "My dad! He's in danger!" The men rushed over, confused. "Calm down, kid. What happened?" "Something took him. A creature on the mountain." They exchanged glances. One of the men, an old-timer with a weathered face, placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. "You saw the god of the mountain?" "I don't know what it was. Please, we have to find him." Without hesitation, some of them grabbed flashlights and weapons, preparing to head up the mountain. The old man shook his head, though. "It's no use. If the god of the mountain took him, there's nothing we can do." Brian couldn't accept that. "But we have to try." "Son," the old man said with sadness in his eyes, "there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Your dad might have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Brian asked, anger mixing with despair. "To appease the mountain's wrath, to keep the balance." The men went searching for Joe but returned at dawn empty-handed. No sign of him. No clues. Nothing. The truck, however, bore deep claw marks and a dark substance no one could identify. Brian was taken back to the city where family members tried to comfort him, but he never got over that night. Local authorities recorded Joe's disappearance as an accident, maybe a fall into some ravine. But Brian knew that wasn't it. Years later, now an adult, he returned to that mountain hoping for answers. He talked to locals, researched old legends, but all he found were fragmented stories about an entity that protected the mountain and demanded sacrifices. On one of his last visits, he found the old man who had helped him that night. "Why my dad?" Brian asked, the pain evident in his voice. "The god of the mountain chooses those with pure hearts," the old man replied. "Your dad was a good man. Maybe he offered himself to protect you." "That doesn't make sense." "Not everything has to make sense, son. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved." Brian left the mountain once more, with more questions than answers. He never truly knew what happened to his dad that night. Whether he fell victim to a mythical creature or something even more terrible, maybe human, was behind his disappearance. What remains are the scars, not just on the old truck he still keeps in his garage, but in his memory. And every time night falls and the wind blows a certain way, he wonders if his dad is out there somewhere watching over him, or if the mountain will come for him someday too. The souls of the cemetery. Ruan from Guatemala always believed that some family stories are better left buried in the past. But one night, while he and his dad, Francisco, were chatting in the backyard under the crescent moon, the conversation drifted back to an old event, something mysterious and scary that happened during Francisco's youth involving a couple known as El Canche and Doña Gila, and a gruesome murder that haunted the region. Ruan's story begins when Francisco, still a boy, faced financial hardships at home and had to start working early. He was responsible for transporting goods for vendors at the central market of a small town in Solola, Guatemala. Since the walk from his house to the market was too long for the chilly early mornings, Francisco accepted an offer to stay a few days a week at the home of El Canche and Doña Gila, a humble couple who lived just 30 meters from the main entrance of the town cemetery. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, Francisco would arrive at the couple's small house. Even though he was used to the environment, the cemetery's proximity and the local ghost stories always made him a bit nervous. The simple room where Francisco slept opened into a hallway where you could see part of the cemetery through the window, and the boy's imagination ran wild, conjuring up the scariest scenes. It was early November, near the Day of All Saints celebrations. The air was colder than usual, and a whitish fog crawled along the ground around the cemetery, creating a ghostly atmosphere. Francisco was getting ready to sleep after a long day of work when he heard the couple whispering in the living room. Curious, he approached quietly. His heart raced as he overheard El Canche murmuring about a gruesome murder that had recently occurred in the town. A missing child found lifeless at the cemetery's edge the previous night. The descriptions were hard to bear without tears. The cruelty of the murder left everyone in town scared and confused. Who could do something so horrible? Francisco lay down, disturbed by the fragments of conversation he'd heard. He wondered if the souls of the dead really wandered around there, as many in the village believed, especially after a terrible death. He tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep, his mind filled with scary images. The next day was a work day. He woke up before dawn. El Canche and Doña Gila were already up, warming coffee on the stove. For Francisco, feeling warm and cared for by that kind couple made everything a bit better. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to experience in the pitch-black darkness of 4 a.m. They got ready to leave as usual. Doña Gila handed Francisco a mug of hot coffee, which he drank quickly to fend off the cold. El Canche grabbed his flashlight and headed to the front door, signaling Francisco to follow. The boy adjusted the blanket around his shoulders, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The air felt biting cold. The fog rose around their feet, making it hard to see more than a few meters ahead, but knowing the path well, they headed toward the market. As they passed in front of the cemetery gate, their peaceful routine was interrupted. Something appeared ahead of them that at first glance looked like a silent procession. But it wasn't a normal procession. The figures were dressed in white, with veils covering their heads, seeming to float above the ground while emitting a strange murmuring in unison. El Canche stopped abruptly, and Francisco, confused, did the same. The intensity of the silence was overwhelming, and Francisco's heart pounded as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. El Canche hizo el signo de la cruz, algo que siempre hacía con respeto por los muertos. Pero esta vez sus manos temblaron tanto que apenas pudo completar el gesto. Francisco remembered every detail. His legs suddenly felt heavy, almost as if they were rooted to the ground. When he tried to move, he found he couldn't. The air around them seemed to get colder, almost freezing. Francisco's fingers went numb, and he could see his breath in the night air. The figures, now more visible, moved slowly toward the cemetery. There was something deeply wrong with them. Their movements didn't seem natural. Each step was slow and synchronized, and their moaning rose and fell, punctuated by sad sighs, echoing through the air in a sinister harmony. Amid the murmurs, Francisco swore he heard his own name. Fear gripped his body. Every part of him was paralyzed, frozen. Suddenly, one of the veils lifted into the air as if blown by a non-existent breeze, revealing a decayed, eyeless face with an expression of infinite despair. A foul odor hit Francisco hard, making him feel nauseous. His heart pounded so fiercely he thought he might faint. Cold tears ran down his face, freezing almost instantly in the terrible cold. He wanted to scream, but his voice was stuck in his throat. The fear was so tangible it seemed to have a life of its own. Beside him, El Canche struggled to raise his hands toward his face to make the sign of the cross again. He seemed to realize they were facing something supernatural and terribly wrong, something connected to the restless souls believed to wander the cemetery. With tremendous effort, El Canche finally completed the sign of the cross, his hand shaking uncontrollably. When he finished the gesture, the figures froze, slowly turning their bodies toward Francisco and El Canche. Their moaning stopped abruptly, and time seemed to stand still. The deafening silence filled the air. El Canche managed to let out a faint groan and somehow mustered the strength to grab Francisco's arm, pulling him toward the market and leaving that disturbing vision behind. Their hurried footsteps echoed in the empty streets, and their desperate run only ended when they reached the town center, where some wooden stalls were already setting up for the day's work. Once they finally felt safe, Francisco collapsed onto a wooden chair next to a coffee stand. His teeth chattered violently. He couldn't stop trembling. The hot coffee offered to him barely helped to ward off the glacial cold that still seemed to envelop his body. El Canche's hands were as cold as ice, and Doña Gila's eyes were wide with fear. Even she, so kind and accustomed to local legends and myths, was terrified. Francisco spent the rest of the day in a state of shock. When he returned to his own family, he refused to tell them what had happened. Only years later, as an adult and married, did he share with Ruan what he had witnessed that early morning. Ruan's father also mentioned the gruesome murder and how that event seemed to coincide with the appearance of the souls in the cemetery. Violent deaths always disrupt the peace between the world of the living and the dead, people said in the village. Over time, Ruan grew up to be a skeptical adult, but his father Francisco's story disturbed him to the point that he could never completely dismiss it. He learned the weight that some family stories carry, and why it's better to keep them in the past. However, Ruan couldn't help but wonder if the suffering souls his father saw that night were somehow connected to the child's murder, unsettled by the evil that had occurred in that place. Cries in the night. The warm night breeze in Limon, Costa Rica, carried the scent of the sea mixed with the smell of damp foliage. Karen would never forget the expression on her cousin Rui's face when he recounted the story he experienced in that coastal region. She still remembers every detail told between silences and apprehensive glances, the way his voice trembled as he described what happened on that fateful night. It all started on one of the darkest nights of the month when Rui and his three best friends, Diego, Omar, and Lucas, decided to go fishing in the small river near Rui's house. They did this almost every week. It was a quiet and relaxing ritual, away from the hustle and bustle of daily life, under the calm of the night. The full moon illuminated their path that particular evening, casting long shadows over the ground covered with fallen leaves. As the group cast their lines into the serene water, they all remained silent, listening only to the gentle bubbling of the river and the distant cawing of some crows in the trees. Then the silence was broken. Not by some common night sound, but by a scream. Not just any scream, but the kind of desperate sound that makes your blood run cold and your heart tighten. A woman was screaming in the distance, her voice full of despair and pain, tearing through the tranquil night. Rui stood up abruptly, looking at his friends with a pale, tense face. "Did you guys hear that? My God, someone needs help." His voice was firm, but there was an almost imperceptible tremor. Diego, the most impulsive, dropped his fishing rod and made a move to run toward the screams. "Someone's getting hurt," he said, anger and fear flickering in his eyes. "Let's go. We need to help." At that moment, the yellow blanket slipped from her arms, falling slowly to the ground. There was no baby inside, just a cold, wet stone stained with something dark. The horrifying discovery almost made Rui's heart stop. He gasped, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely helpless and terrified. The woman turned her face toward them, her mouth now open in a silent scream, yet still so terrifying. Her clothes stained with mud and what looked like blood reflected under the pale moonlight. Diego took a step back, stepping on a branch that snapped with a dry crack. It was as if a spell had been broken at that instant. The woman snapped her head in the direction of the sound. Her wails then resumed, louder than ever, and before they could react, she began to float toward them. The despair and agony in her cry were so intense that the group felt a wave of freezing panic flood their bodies. Rui doesn't remember much of what happened next, only his friend screaming, his weak legs stumbling over roots, and the sensation of cold air as he ran toward the car. They ran as if their lives depended on it, because maybe they did. As they crossed the road, Rui glanced back for an instant. He saw that thin silhouette standing in the middle of the path, arms outstretched, mouth open in a silent wail. In the blink of an eye, she vanished, leaving behind only the echo of screams in their minds and the yellow sheet on the moonlit ground. The drive back home felt endless. Rui and his friends drove in complete silence, unable to believe what they'd witnessed. Rui's mind replayed every detail, every frozen second of terror. He saw the woman's pale face, the dark eyes, her floating body. Her scream still pulsed inside his head, making his hands tremble as he gripped the steering wheel. After that night, Rui never went fishing at that river in the early hours again. He stayed awake many nights, haunted by the wails that still echoed in his mind. To this day, Karen says her cousin couldn't give a logical explanation for what they saw. The tears he holds back when talking about that experience show that part of his soul was forever marked by the fear and mystery of that weeping, floating woman in the night, known as the dreaded La Llorona.